the presentation today I titled The Dawn of Transforming Food Systems Towards Healthier and Affordable Diets Produced in a Sustainable Way. And I specifically say the dawn because we are just beginning a very serious evaluation or reevaluation of changes in the food system that will produce healthier, sustainable, and affordable diets. If I could have the next slide, please. So the Decade of Action on Nutrition, 2016 to 2025, which is coordinated by FAO and WHO, has identified sustainable food systems as one of 6 action areas aimed at addressing the recommendations from the International Nutrition Conference 2, the global nutrition and diet-related targets for non-communicable diseases, and also contributing to the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. If I could have the next slide. More recently, this September 2021, we had the UN Food Systems Summit, which even more so reinforced transforming food systems and really was looking at what are the bold, new, innovative approaches that we can use in order to use food systems to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. And while some would say all of the Sustainable Development Goals, either directly or indirectly, relate to nutrition, the 2 that really have been the focus of nutrition in discussions around food systems have been Sustainable Goal 2, Zero Hunger. And if we unpackage that, it includes ending hunger, achieving food security, improving nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. And then the next one, next slide, please. That's been an area of focus has been Sustainable Development Goal 12, ensure sustainable consumption and sustainable production patterns. Next slide, please. The kernel of the idea or the emphasis on food systems early on really emerged because of the alarm about the increased epidemic of overweight and obesity. And this put an emphasis on food system transformation as a way of dealing with overweight and obesity. And at about the same time, we began to hear the term malnutrition in all its forms. And this was a real, in some ways, sea change because it acknowledged the fact that there's a continuum of malnutrition going from undernutrition to overweight and obesity. And in the next slide, we see from the very recently released Global Nutrition Report that 2.2 billion people globally are overweight. And of that, 772 million are obese. And that number continues to climb. Next slide, please. The health burden of poor diets is substantial and rising. And in fact, poor diets are the chief #1 modifiable area in which we can by changing, can contribute to improve health. And we see here the contribution to premature deaths of inadequate consumption of various food groups like fruits, whole grains, etc., as well as overconsumption of certain food groups. And then at the bottom, the contribution of overweight, obesity, and undernutrition, underweight. And what I was taken in this slide, again from the Global Nutrition Report, is how small the contribution of premature deaths, how small the contribution of undernutrition is. Yes, it's still a problem, but if we had looked at these data 30 years ago, the relative contribution of undernutrition to premature deaths would have been much higher. Next slide, please. Here we look at the fact that we are globally and regionally off track to meet the environmental targets related to food systems, and the areas that have been targeted in this slide are greenhouse gas emissions, cropland use, fresh water, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And the line about a quarter way up of this slide, 100%, shows that for all regions of the world, we are below the agreed upon targets. And particularly noteworthy is substantially above the greenhouse gas emission targets for North America, Oceania, Latin America, and Europe. Next slide, please. So food systems, there are very, very long definitions out of UN and elsewhere on what food systems are, but I like to use shorthand. Either food systems means from farm to fork, or farm to table, or farm to flush. Next slide, please. And FAO and WHO have outlined the multiple dimensions of sustainable healthy diets, promote all aspects of individual health and well-being, low environmental impact, healthy diets must be accessible, affordable, safe, equitable, and culturally acceptable. Next slide, please. I'm going to focus on one specific barrier to healthy eating, and if I could have the next slide, which is the cost of a healthful diet. And the next few slides I am presenting, and we need some animation here, the next few slides I'm presenting come from work of my colleague Will Masters at Tufts University. And what he has done is categorize diets into 4 levels or 4 steps, as you see in this slide. The lowest step is daily energy, and this is really just subsistence diets where you're meeting only caloric adequacy. Then you move up to nutrient adequacy, which is an analysis based on 23 essential micro and macronutrients. Healthy diets, so the cost of a diet based on national food-based dietary guidelines. And finally, the top step is the Eat Lancet diet, which is considered a planetary health diet. Next slide, please. Next one, please. And what we see here is when you look at food costs, let's start with the bottom in blue, the cost of survival, which is the lowest cost diet at about 75 cents per day. The cost of that diet doesn't really vary very much across low income countries up to high income countries. Same thing with cost of nutrient adequacy. If I could have I think there's animation in this. And then the cost of recommended diets. So you go from 75 cents a day to $2 a day to $3.50 a day. One more animation in that, I think. And you see the smaller step between the nutrient adequate diet versus a healthful diet is due primarily to the lower cost of dairy. Next slide, please. These data come out of the recent State of Food Insecurity and Nutrition report. What you see here is 185 million people can't even afford a subsistence diet. About 1.5 billion people cannot afford a nutrient adequate diet, and approximately 3 billion people cannot afford what we consider a healthy diet. The majority of these individuals come out of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Next slide, please. I'll skip that. Next slide, please. Next. Here we look at, and this has been a big issue, does adding sustainability or a sustainability criterion raise diet costs? And again, let's start at the bottom of this graph where you have what I call the subsistence diet, where you're only meeting energy intake. And what you see there is across national income per person, you don't see variations in the cost of the diet. Adding a sustainability criterion. Same thing when you look at nutrient adequacy, which is based on those 23 nutrients, including macronutrients. Same when you look at a healthy diet. And finally, when you look at the Eat Lancet diet. So the sustainability criterion need not add to the cost of a healthy diet. Next slide, please. We've already talked about this. If we could have all the animation on this, for about 3 billion people, which is 40% of the world, healthy diets remain beyond reach. But under that, look at that third bullet. Adding sustainability criteria does not raise diet costs because least cost items are not resource intensive. Healthy diets are affordable. And I think this is important to emphasize. Healthy diets, even where they are affordable, are often not chosen. And that really gets into the issue of preferences, cultural preferences, tastes, and other issues. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next. Okay. So a lot of discussion now that the UN Food Systems Summit has happened are revolving around commitments made at the summit. And I've lost track of how many. I used to say 300, it's now in the thousands. But what are the critical actions that are needed in transforming food systems? And I want to emphasize in this discussion that most of them in the effective transformation of food systems will happen at the national level. If I can have the next slide, please. This slide comes from an article in Nature Food by Patrick Webb, my colleague at Tufts, and others, looking at categorizing critical actions at the national level. And this was put into 4 quadrants: availability, accessibility, desirability, and affordability. And we've talked already a lot about affordability. But let me take that first quadrant and unpackage that a little bit and look at availability. One of the items under this talks about promoting production of a wide range of nutrient-rich foods. And indeed, when we look at a lot of national plans, both national nutrition plans, as well as national agricultural plans, we see an emphasis at country level in diversifying range of commodity production, moving away from an exclusive emphasis on basic staples to more nutrient-rich foods. What this particular slide does not capture, though, is the trade-offs in trying to achieve some of these actions that are depicted in this slide. And I know later on from Professor Martin Bloom, we'll hear much more about trade-offs, but I want to use just one example that is reflected in the next slide. This is some work we have completed in Ethiopia, where we were interested in understanding at the household level how decisions are made related to production, consumption, and marketing of crops. We looked at 4 agriculturally productive regions in Ethiopia, and we were really interested in unpackaging, that should say SDG 2, Zero Hunger, strategies for improving food security and nutrition at the household level. One very, very clear finding across the 4 regions and almost to the last household is that households were unequivocal that a priority for the household production strategies was that they produce staple foods first as a strategy to ensure food security. And it was only when food security needs of the household were met that they were likely to move into the production of more nutrient-rich foods. And I mention this because, again, the goal or objective in a lot of these national plans, let's diversify production, will not be successful until we look at how we complement that strategy of production of nutrient-rich foods by ensuring that staple food production is equally productive or greater. And so it's thinking about the trade-off at household level and what are policies and programs that governments can put in place to allow some of these changes in transforming the food system in order to meet these maybe competing objectives. And I could go into a lot of other examples, but I think this one will suffice. And I think my next slide. Now, what are the game-changing actions? And what we kept hearing over and over again, both before the summit and after the UN Food Systems Summit, we need bold, feasible, sustainable solutions that have impact. We're not there yet. There are lots of potentially attractive or effective innovations, changes that are being put forward. But the rest of the story is going to need a boots on the ground perspective. And by that, I mean, what are the successful evidence-based policies that are bold, feasible, and sustainable at country level? And how many of these solutions are context specific? We have huge gaps in our understanding of this. And I think it's obviously an area which is ripe for what I call implementation or applied research. The momentum is there, in part given the emphasis in the Decade of Action on Nutrition and also the recently completed UN Food Systems Summit. And now we need the rest of the story. We need to have the investment in R&D. Thank you.